Hi, and thank you very much for coming to listen to my talk today. It's a great pleasure to be with you all virtually, and I hope that wherever in the world you are, you're safe and well. My name is Marnie McCormack, and I'm going to talk to you a little today about what I've learned from taking a Human Agile retrospective on 2020. We really, in our professional careers, have not had an experience like the one we've had in the last year. And I spent a little time considering what we could learn from that and how we might use it to inform our future, and particularly how we might use it to do better for our people, for our teams, and for our products in the next 2 years together. In my day job, I'm a managing director at JP Chase, but really I'm a software engineer. And I thought that taking a software engineer's approach to a retrospective on 2020 and using some of the approaches we might use on systems on the year that we've experienced would be a useful one. And I hope that you enjoy some of the insights that I've gained that I'm going to share with you today. So if you take a systems approach to understanding problems, we might often in software use reverse engineering. And the goal for that is to get a better understanding of systems and code and how they work. It always takes time to become familiar with software that you didn't write, even when you have the code and you perhaps have people around you who do understand it. It's much more difficult actually to understand people. You don't have the code, you didn't write it, and often they can't explain themselves that well. But there are some similarities in the ways that we can approach gaining insight into the human effects on Agile software teams of 2020. So if we walk through the goal of reverse engineering, typically what we're trying to do is understand how an object works so that we can duplicate it and enhance the object. Usually you're reverse engineering when you have a problem and you're trying to gain some insight into how you might solve it. We could take a similar approach to 2020. It would be hard for most of us to say that we had a frame of reference or we had some tools that would let us parse or understand the effect of 2020. And so I decided that it might be useful to take a software approach. If we are reverse engineering code, we might examine the static properties of the code. We might just have a look at the shape and the structure of the code that we're trying to understand better or solve a problem with. In humans, that might better be described as habits. Do you see changes in how the people in your team are functioning, their habits? Are they less talkative than normal? Are they less present? Are they less engaged? Some of those practical signs can be useful indicators for understanding what's happening to your teams. We may, if we're looking at code, identify strings and API calls. We may look at certain markers in our code that are important. Looking at how humans communicate is equally useful. Is their fuse a little shorter than usual? Are they perhaps not contributing verbally? And bear in mind that one of the great changes or large changes that 2020 brought us was a need for us all to be able to converse verbally and explain almost everything that we were doing with words, which is quite a shift for some engineers who may perhaps have preferred to stand at a whiteboard and draw pictures, or may perhaps have enjoyed actually pairing in real life with other people rather than having to explain virtually always. And much as our virtual environments are much better and they've come a long way, they're no real substitute for the ways perhaps that we worked before. Performing behaviour analysis of your code can also be useful. In humans, I might describe that as impatience, bickering, some of the symptoms that teams under pressure may display. Typically, those types of symptoms in a normal year would be recoverable. Some of those things are harder to recover from in a remote environment. It's important to understand the effect of them. So if we were also to look at this, that you may perhaps, as your understanding of code increases, add comments. One of the things that I have found is if you're engaging with teams or engaging with individually one-on-one, taking notes is quite useful because it allows me to consider after a conversation where there are signals or symptoms that were apparent in that discussion that perhaps we didn't explore together that maybe need some attention, in the same way as perhaps you might add comments to your code for your to-dos, or where you're not absolutely certain how something works, or actually capturing how you do think something works so that the next person who comes after you can gain from that. Similarly, it can actually be helpful And with my teams, particularly with my leadership teams, it's actually useful to talk about what we've observed, about how we're working, and then everyone can give their thoughts and opinions and have input in that. So it's almost as though that comment, like in code, is shared and people can let you know what they observe or think as well. And finally, when we're reverse engineering, often you don't just do it once, we do it a number of times. I think it would be useful to say that the situation for all of us, as people have put it, we're all in the same situation, but we're not in quite the same boat. It ebbs and flows, and so you should be prepared to do that reverse engineering analysis more than once on the object that is us and how we interact together. So if I was move on to talk a little bit around how you might debug human beings. So most of us have typically had to debug, and my background is heavily Java, but you may have had to debug based on a stack trace and try to step back to understand the path that a code problem has walked to get to the symptom that you're seeing, which might be an error or an exception in production. What's the signal that you are seeing? So what do you get as a result from your team? But then importantly, understanding what does that mean in terms of just not the symptom, but the path that was walked. One of the things that I found useful in terms of debugging our Agile teams is to ask more questions. I don't typically attend my team's rituals. I'm not the product owner. I don't lead all of the everyday engineering. So you don't usually need me in there, but it can actually be quite useful for me to understand the signals that are in there. Are the team holding each other accountable in discussions? Are we making good, clear progress? Is everyone clear about what we're doing next? Some of those signals can be useful to understand when you get a symptom, for example, where maybe work isn't progressing very well or the team have got a bit stuck on things, and it gives me insight into the path that we walked to get there. The other piece is inspection. So if we were to compare that, perhaps inspecting our code to what we're doing now with people to inspect them as talking. And the example I would use is, we've gone from talking to talking this year a lot, all of the time and endlessly, which is great and necessary, but very two-dimensional. We cannot easily fix that to be normal, but we can use other mechanisms to establish a shared mental model, to understand if we've got agreement. Oftentimes, actually, you understand in a room full of your team together, or your peers or your stakeholders, where they have agreement. Body language is a huge signal for that. It's really difficult to get that from Zoom. I mean, 50% of the problem is holding the attention of everyone that you're talking with on Zoom, which I'm trying to do today for all of you virtually. But also, what you tend to find is where you have an absence of those informal cues that you would normally use to measure agreement and see if you have consensus and take the temperature of a room full of people. Actually, we have to write some of that down. And what I realized late last year was that where we were perhaps going wrong, or the team had a disagreement, or we couldn't reach consensus, we had to start writing down the ways in which we would share our mental models much more than we did before, not because particularly we'd become more invested in process, but because we had to find different creative ways to fill the void that not being together had opened for us. And then finally, where we talk about querying here. So you may actually go and examine the data behind a problem in your code path. Oftentimes you may find when you're debugging that you've got an edge case, a path that you weren't expected to walk, that maybe you haven't caught and handled very gracefully. The same can be true with people. Looking for the data, understanding the ways in which you can get that, talking to different people, talking to them as a group together, asking questions in forums. We've used surveys a lot more broadly this year. And that element of both personal and more impersonal mechanisms can get you a range of data that can give you insight into, again, the path that you walked to a problem and then how you might best tackle it. So when I was thinking about these problems, I decided that I would take a systems approach to this. I've been running software systems for a long time, and one of the remarks that I share with my teams is that I really can cope with anything. I can manage any situation. The one that I like to cope with least is predictable failure. I find it very disheartening when you see a problem looming towards you on the horizon and you talk about it and you try and tackle it, and yet it still lands and you have to deal with it. And it may ruin your day, your week, your month, or worse. And I do really like to try and avoid those failures that I can already see. In the picture on the screen now, this is from system failure, and it was from an analysis describing the potential impact of maintenance work on physical systems with a RUL, which is the remaining useful life of a system. And the box here shows if you perform maintenance on a system, you can extend its remaining useful life. But the good news about human teams is that failure is not predictable, it's avoidable. And actually, therefore, the value of maintenance is higher. So when we talk in this picture about failure as an inverse pyramid, typically gradual, variable, it ebbs and flows. Certain things can accelerate it. You can have intermittent blips, but the really good thing about agile teams versus systems is there's a lot that you can do to treat it. As a treatment, one of the things I would say that's most important to recognise is that really time is the best treatment. Giving teams time to do maintenance together, to invest in their personal relationships, to make that part of how they work and not a thing that we expect them to do on the side is really important. When you have degrading relationships, which I think almost everybody does at the moment have degrading relationships, most of us are perhaps not always feeling like the best versions of ourselves. And when we get together, that's a collective problem. The value of maintenance there is about investing in our personal relationships. It's a shared responsibility. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's very important for all teams to invest in out of sprint cycles. Over the last few years, I've always given my teams a break in their sprint cycles. We typically break once every 3 months and have a full week out of sprint cycles. And that's a really useful way to let people invest in maintenance for themselves, but also in their relationships and the engagements with the team, and let us talk about some of those things. Or maybe in some cases, let us talk a little bit less. So the other piece of analysis that I did was about some of the psychological thinking around the effect of unpredictable contexts on humans. And one of the things that I think was useful to share from my learning was that the experiences of the last year will have changed some of us forever. So even though we might hope at some point to return to what we would consider normal or some version of new normal, the changes, the experience of the last year, year and a half will have on people may remain with them, and it may have changed how they think forever. There's a psychological term called RUPE, which it talks about people's response to positive stimulation. So often it's used in gambling, where essentially if you are betting and you are winning in a gambling scenario, people will continue to have that behaviour. And if they lose, like in that right box, you see lose shift behavioural adjustment, is when they start to lose, they may change that behaviour. What the research shows is that if people consider their environment to be unpredictable, and that's really important, different people will feel differently about what constitutes an unpredictable environment, they may start to behave in lose shift ways more unpredictably. So their patterns of their behaviour may no longer be predictable. And that's because what's influencing their behaviour is how they feel about how unpredictable the environment is. If they feel they have no real control over their circumstances, they may behave differently and they may respond differently to what we might perhaps to be traditional cues. What motivates people may well have changed. The other piece of that is what you or I consider unpredictable, and how anxious that makes us feel has a real bearing on this. Some people are more prone to feeling anxious about unpredictability. They enjoy change less perhaps than their peers. They really value control and predictability. And I would suggest a lot of highly technical people like control. It's about how they feel that the world is right around them. And if you are a person who's sensitive to that, you may have more anxiety. And again, that may again lead to more unpredictable behaviour. And I think it's important for us all to understand that the unpredictability in the environment that we've experienced may have changed some of our people's human responses forever. And really importantly, it's probably changed us. So we should have some insight into how we might re-baseline as a team. Let's talk about our team agreements and what matters to us collectively. And let's try and be transparent about how we feel about what we're doing and what we value together, so that we have, again, some shared understanding. So the other piece of reading that I did was this OECD paper. You can't see it all that well on the right, but essentially the OECD published a paper in April last year that reflected on the impact of COVID on the function of global systems, and also the differentiating factors that affected the outcome for different places in the world. They also outlined the types of strategies that can be used generally to manage what they consider to be systemic threats at scale. And what the picture here outlines in the pink is that an approach centred on planning can enable systems to absorb the impact and minimise the effect of large systemic events like the pandemic. This is really useful as an approach for us also. We can plan effectively to absorb and otherwise offset what may be the impact of unpredictability. And it's one of the biggest opportunities that we have in 2021 and beyond. We don't always in Agile have a great mental model for how to do contingency. And in actually waterfall systems, we're quite a bit more upfront about increasing your planned contingency for any piece of work in line with what you might perceive to be the risk or the things that you did not understand very well. So that, again, is an opportunity for us. I think that it's important that we should all baseline on that actually we do live in a more unpredictable environment in a number of ways, and allowing some slack in your team's work commitments to deal with that is really important. It is always easy to do more than you had committed to. It's always difficult to do less than you had committed to. So as leaders, as managers, as product managers, as engineering leads, be trying to find ways in which to give your team the ability to absorb and recover from unpredictability. And we'll get better collective output from the teams because we'll be able to support them. Because actually, again, back to the previous slide, they may feel less anxious in understanding that we have more mechanisms, levers that we can pull to support them when there are challenges. I highly recommend the reading of the OECD paper, A Systemic Approach. It's really insightful, but perhaps read it when you're feeling cheerful on a good day. That's probably quite a difficult read at the moment. So finally, I would like to close by reflecting on this picture that I drew in, I think, 2018. I did a talk in 2018 about the stages of team formation. Excuse me. And it was really driven off conversations that I had perhaps with less experienced managers around their expectations about how different teams would respond to how they were engaged to work together. And what it was really planned to illustrate is that teams develop over time, and time is essentially the common factor in team development. There are other factors. You want a nice blend of skills and personalities and experience, perhaps, but really the most important ingredient in the formation of a team was time. And I used to talk about that every team starts as a set of individuals who have different goals and objectives, who are engaged in activities independently of one another. You can see in the picture on the top left that, some of our individuals are perhaps dancing, others are doing headstands, got some meditation. The person top left is very confused. That is pretty common. That's how all teams start out. And when you talk to that set of individuals, they do not feel that you talk to them as a collective, but rather they may hear you individually. And unless you address them individually with, for example, a task, so take a task from your Scrum board or from your Kanban, they may not see that as an action for them to take. Unless experienced managers can find that quite frustrating because they don't understand why they have to be so specific, because really, surely in Agile, we self-organise. In the middle picture, the next step might be that your team starts to be a group of individuals. They may have formed some interpersonal relationships. There may be some pockets where the team feels shared responsibility, or some individuals have clear overlap or engagement. And so you may get more cooperation without direction. You may have some areas of the team where they will naturally, for example, work together on different areas. And that's the natural next stage. Then perhaps they might feel like a group, longer, so quite so individual, but they may have a really organic team agreement in place. They may function as a group. And then finally, the sort of nirvana for all Agile teams really is the notion of a self-organising team. And I've always illustrated the story with how you know that you have a self-organising team is that you go on holiday and no one calls you. Or if they call you, it's with a really sensible question where they should have called you, and not because things have gone horribly wrong in your absence. And that's always how I would judge that really I have a self-organising team. But it takes a lot of time and it takes support. And it also takes you as a manager to recognise that for self-organising teams pre-2020, you had to get out the way to let them self-organise. I think reverse engineering 2020 has highlighted for me that we can expect team formation to be cyclical, for teams to ebb and flow through the stages based on the circumstances of the individuals in that team, perhaps the country of the world that they live in, perhaps their personal situation at home, perhaps more fundamentally their health. And I used to always think that in team concepts, if you had this group of individuals on the top left and you had an individual doing perhaps, yoga headstands, that wasn't a great thing, that it wasn't helpful to an agile team. But reflecting on 2020 makes me realise that actually the primary importance of each individual in a team taking care of themselves and their needs can't be overplayed for the next period of our lives. And so actually sometimes that might be what you want, is actually you do want your teams to be individually meeting their needs so that they have the ability, the bandwidth, the capability to then act as part of the team. And the ebbing and flowing between these cycles might be normal. And actually, maybe gone are the days where the manager should always get out of the way. Maybe we should expect to be more closely involved with our teams to support them for the next 12 to 18 months and be thoughtful about how to support different teams, different individuals in different ways. So I would summarise by saying my learning from reverse engineering 2020 is that now more than ever, human-centric Agile has to be the goal for us all. 2021 is still a greenfield project. We have the opportunity to design and plan it together, and we could consciously aim to do better by our teams, our stakeholders, and our products, reflecting on 2021. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope this has been useful for you, and I hope your 2021 is a great project. Thank you.